a private line lit up at Clarence House. Only 2 people had access to that number. What King Charles heard on the other end shattered his planned abdication. 1 call, 1 name, 1 document that had never been meant for him. He froze, heart pounding. Windsor, the symbol of everything royal, had been transferred without his knowledge. And to William, before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For months, the decision had been forming in silence. King Charles had been preparing quietly, deliberately to step away, not in scandal, not in collapse, but in what he believed would be a controlled, dignified transition, one final act of duty after a lifetime of waiting. Only a microscopic circle inside the palace knew. A handful of documents had been drafted, discreet conversations held, the unannounced spring date circled in red on a private calendar few had ever seen. He was tired. Not weak, but tired in the way only a man who had lived in the shadow of a crown for 70 years could be. Abdication was not surrender. It was, in his mind, release. Then the phone rang. The voice on the other end did not begin with ceremony. There were no formalities, no careful palace phrasing, only urgency, strain. A tremor that instantly told Charles this was not another routine briefing or ceremonial adjustment. A senior palace official, one of the Queen's most trusted, spoke quickly, as if afraid the line itself might be listening. A sealed clause had been activated, a clause personally ordered by Queen Elizabeth before her passing, a clause that had never been logged in the public registry, a clause that did not concern jewels or funds or portraits but Windsor. At first Charles laughed. Not in amusement, but in reflex. Windsor was not merely an estate. It was the spine of the monarchy, the emotional heart of the crown, the place where history breathed through stone. It could not simply be transferred. Not without him. Not without the king. He demanded documentation. He demanded confirmation. He demanded to know who else had seen this. But as the official spoke, naming dates, witnesses, handwritten endorsements, something colder than disbelief began to creep in, because this had the Queen's fingerprints on it. Windsor had been bound to the sovereign for centuries. It was where monarchs retreated when the world became too loud, where secrets were kept, where decisions were made that never reached parchment. Charles had always imagined Windsor as the final inheritance of his reign, the one place that was not political, not performative, but profoundly personal. And now he was being told that the Queen, his mother, had redirected it, solely, legally, irrevocably. To William, the words landed like quiet detonations, solely, transferred, activated, not upon abdication, not upon death. But now, in that moment, the idea of stepping aside collapsed. The abdication papers on his desk no longer looked like instruments of peace. They looked like evidence of a man about to walk away from something he had never truly been given. Questions flooded him faster than the official could answer. When had this been drafted? Who had witnessed it? Why had he never been told? And the one question he did not yet speak, but which echoed louder than all the rest, why William? Because this was not only about property. This was about intention, about legacy, about whether the Queen, even in her final days, had been shaping a future that did not include him in the way he had always believed. The call ended, but the sound of it did not. It stayed in the room, in his chest, in the long echoing spaces of memory, where every childhood moment of waiting suddenly rearranged itself into something far more painful. Windsor had not been promised, it had been positioned, and that meant something else had been decided long before this moment. As Charles hung up, trembling, the room around him spun not from age but betrayal. What else had the Queen orchestrated behind the velvet curtain? Hidden beneath royal ledgers, locked in the Queen's private desk drawer for years, was a clause no one expected and everyone feared. It wasn't just about property, it was about power. It named William, and no one else. For decades, Queen Elizabeth had operated with the discipline of silence. But her silence, it turns out, was layered with intention, deep within a private ledger, marked for sovereign eyes only. Nestled between unassuming estate reviews and ceremonial instructions was a handwritten clause no royal aide dared speak of aloud. It bore her unmistakable cursive and a signature dated just months before her passing. This was not a minor adjustment. This was a transfer of epic consequence, one that tore through centuries of convention. The ledger recorded the full authority, control, and symbolic stewardship of Windsor, its land, its legacy, its power bestowed entirely upon Prince William. No contingencies, no shared guardianship, no mention of Charles. Confidential testimonies from senior aides, now shaken by the clause's discovery, confirm the Queen began revisiting the Windsor documents soon after Brexit, when the monarchy's relevance and resilience were thrust under scrutiny. During those private evenings at Balmoral and late-night sessions at Windsor Castle, she reread the original state orders and scribbled thoughts in the margins. In one entry, chilling in hindsight, she wrote, "Legacy must evolve with integrity, not inheritance." That single sentence, tucked beneath a paragraph of legal phrasing, now carries the weight of a dynasty. Legal analysts brought in after the clause's unsealing were stunned. The clause didn't just reassign ceremonial oversight, it altered the legal framework itself, triggering a dormant succession lever the Queen had engineered quietly over a decade. This wasn't reactionary, it was long planned, and as soon as the ink dried she had it locked away, knowing full well it would be discovered only after her departure. The chaos that erupted behind the palace gates was instant. Documents were rushed to internal advisors, emergency calls were made. Several senior figures, those close to Charles, were reportedly barred from accessing the original ledger. Others demanded to see the Queen's reasoning. What drove her to cut Charles out of a decision so central to royal power? Rumours swirled. Some claimed she believed Windsor needed youth and modernity to survive the coming years. Others said her bond with William had grown quietly stronger than the one she shared with her own son. Whatever the truth, Charles's name was absent, intentionally, and for royal insiders, that omission was deafening. This wasn't just a reshuffling of estates, it was a signal one that shattered assumptions about Charles's standing in his mother's eyes. His reaction, still reeling from the phone call that upended his abdication, would soon give way to something far more dangerous: doubt. Because if Windsor had been sealed for William, what did that mean for Charles's throne? And more importantly, why had the Queen waited until the very end to act? She rarely raised her voice, but when she did, it changed dynasties. In the last months of her life, Queen Elizabeth II held 4 private conversations with her most trusted confidants. None included Charles. Every single one revolved around William, behind the walls of Windsor and the silence of royal protocols. Something shifted in those final months. Staff began to notice patterns, subtle but deliberate. William's visits to the Queen became more frequent, more secluded, and markedly longer. Where once Charles had been the presumed voice in the Queen's ear, it was now William who walked alongside her in the gardens, who stayed behind after official engagements, and who was summoned in quiet hours with no announcement. Senior aides whispered of closed-door meetings, always between the Queen and her grandson, never including the King in waiting. A deliberate omission, not a matter of circumstance. And it didn't go unnoticed. In one especially telling moment, an aide recalled the Queen referring to William not by title, but by a name drenched in meaning, the stabilizer. She had used the word before in times of chaos, in moments of uncertainty, but never so intimately. She followed it with another, spoken so softly that only 2 people in the room caught it: my safeguard. These were not terms of affection, they were terms of trust. She saw William not as merely an heir, but as a pillar, a solution. As preparations for Windsor's future were revisited one last time, the Queen made a bold decision: Charles would not be present. Sources confirmed she held a final round of estate review meetings, but made it explicitly clear that they were to be attended only by her estate legal team, and William. A royal staff member, close enough to overhear through a partially open door, remembered one phrase that cut through all others: "It is no longer about lineage, it is about continuity, duty over blood." That line, repeated quietly in the staff quarters, became a phrase of legend, chilling in its finality, devastating in its implication. The Queen had watched the world shift around her: scandals, divisions, a public growing weary of tradition without transparency. She knew the crown could not withstand another fracture. Her fear wasn't about her legacy, it was about survival. And in William, she saw a future the public could still believe in, a fresh symbol without the weight of the past's bruises. That belief didn't merely inform her decisions, it cemented them. Then came the envelope. It was sealed with her personal wax stamp, not addressed to the Privy Council, not to Parliament, not even to Charles. The writing on the front was clear, unshaking, my crown's future. It was handed to a senior aide on the day before her final public appearance, and locked away per her explicit instructions, with orders it be given to Charles only upon activation of the Windsor clause. When he opened it, the weight of his mother's unspoken judgment fell heavy. There were no apologies, no justifications, only a truth she had hidden for years, now delivered in her own hand. That letter didn't just explain Windsor, it questioned the throne itself, and when Charles read it, something inside him broke. Behind closed doors, King Charles whispered the words he never imagined he'd speak. Aloud, "She never believed in me." In the solitude of the council room, the monarch who spent a lifetime waiting felt smaller than ever, betrayed not by Parliament, but by his own mother. The moment he finished reading the Queen's final letter, there was no fury, no defiance, only stillness so complete it unsettled everyone in the room. Witnesses would later describe him as silent, then shattered. He didn't speak for several minutes. When he finally did, it wasn't with the voice of a sovereign, it was the voice of a son, wounded by a truth he had long suspected but never dared to confirm. The Queen's meticulous language had left no room for misinterpretation. She had entrusted Windsor's legacy, not to her firstborn, but to her grandson, not as a temporary solution, not as a contingency, but as a final, irreversible choice. Charles wasn't omitted by error, he was excluded by design. That evening, Charles sat alone with Camila in a private antechamber, and in a moment stripped of protocol and pride, he confessed the very fracture he had buried for decades. "She never fully saw me," he said, "not as a king, not even as a son sometimes." Camila, known for her stoicism, reportedly didn't respond immediately. There was nothing to fix, nothing to spin. This wasn't politics, it was pain raw and exposed. The carefully constructed facade of duty Charles had maintained for 74 years began to crumble, layer by layer, under the weight of unspoken rejection. Memories flooded him, not of grand ceremonies or royal milestones, but of quiet moments where he had felt dismissed, overshadowed, as a boy always taught to suppress emotion, as a young man constantly corrected for terts, offness, as an heir watched but rarely heard. The Queen's mantra had always been duty above all, but for Charles that duty had become a prison, and the letter confirmed what he had feared since childhood, that no matter how faithfully he served, he had never truly earned her faith in return. Then came the confrontation. A late-night exchange with William, behind locked doors, erupted into a clash no royal adviser had predicted. Charles didn't shout, but his voice, hoarse and breaking, cut deeper than any command. "You knew," he said, "not as an accusation, but as a wound reopening." William, caught off guard, offered no denial. The silence that followed spoke louder than words. It was the silence of 2 generations, forever changed by a mother's final decision. Days later, during a private meeting with the palace clergy, Charles broke down entirely. Those present described his grief as uncontrollable, his sobs echoing off stone walls that had once made him feel safe. The king composed in public, ceremonial in posture, was reduced to a man grasping at fragments of identity. When he emerged from that room, there was no official statement, but he called his chief of staff, and in a calm yet resolute tone declared he would postpone his abdication indefinitely. The staff was stunned. The machinery of succession, already in motion, screeched to a halt. William remained poised. Camila remained silent. The entire palace held its breath. But if the king wouldn't step aside, and William held Windsor, what power dynamics were left standing in the monarchy? While Charles wrestled with heartbreak, William remained composed and eerily prepared, as if he had been waiting, because he had. "She told me everything," he reportedly told Princess Anne. And now, the crown was pivoting with or without Charles. From the moment the Queen's sealed letter surfaced and Windsor's true succession was revealed, William's response was not one of shock, but affirmation. Those closest to him described his silence as purposeful, not passive. He did not seek to reassure Charles, nor did he make public statements of unity. He merely continued on, as though the inevitable had finally arrived. And now, the palace machinery that once orbited around Charles had subtly realigned itself toward William quietly, precisely, with unnerving efficiency. In truth, it had already been happening long before the public had any idea. This wasn't a takeover, it was a transfer, sanctioned by the Queen herself and orchestrated with calculated patience. The timeline, once pieced together, told a very different story than the one the public had been fed. For over a year before the Queen's passing, William had been included in Windsor-related briefings initially reserved only for the sovereign. Documents show his name appearing in security memos, restoration budgets, and confidential estate strategy discussions. His signature began appearing on pre-approval slips for staffing shifts at Windsor, particularly in departments tied to long-term royal engagements and ceremonial continuity. While Charles remained the figurehead of the monarchy, William had been quietly granted operational influence piece by piece, meeting by meeting. And behind William, always a step away from public attention, was Catherine. The Princess of Wales played a critical role not as a strategist in front of flashing cameras, but as the steady hand behind William's discipline. Palace aides later revealed that Catherine had personally urged William not to contest the Queen's silence with Charles, but instead to remain still, measured, predictable. "Let the truth speak when the time comes," she reportedly said. Her instincts were right. The letter did the speaking. William did not have to lift a finger to claim Windsor because it had already been placed in his palm. One of the most telling signs of William's growing control came with personnel shifts within Windsor Castle's inner staff. New appointments were made discreetly, key figures brought in from William's existing team at Kensington Palace. Their roles were marked as temporary, but their influence became permanent. They began shaping the internal structure around modern expectations, leaner security, digital archives, protocol rehearsals aimed at a younger generation. It was William's vision, not Charles's, being implemented in the very heart of royal tradition. Perhaps the most startling revelation came from Princess Anne herself. In a closed conversation at Balmoral, she reportedly confronted William about the Queen's intentions. Instead of denying, William simply nodded and said, "She told me everything." Their conversation, according to insiders, ended not in dispute but in strategy. The two began meeting regularly in private, drawing up emergency transition plans and reviewing the Crown's public readiness should Charles step down or be forced to. More than one royal aide remarked that William wasn't preparing to lead, he was already leading. And if anyone questioned it, the Queen's clause regarding Windsor was now the ultimate shield. To the public, William still played the patient son. But internally, he had become the spine of the institution, silently reinforcing every pillar the monarchy stood on. But behind William's stoic exterior, pressure was building from forces both inside and outside the palace walls. Once considered Charles's most unwavering ally, Queen Consort Camila now finds herself in a palace growing colder by the hour. Staff movements, sudden communication breakdowns, and an empty seat beside William. Has the Queen Consort been quietly pushed aside? Camilla's presence once carried the unshakable weight of proximity to power. In Charles's ascension, she was the figure who stood beside him, not behind. But now, with the unexpected shift in Windsor's future and the Queen's final blow, dealt in secret, something around Camilla has changed. There's a silence where her voice once carried influence, a disconnection where her network once thrived. In recent Windsor strategy briefings, her absence has not only been noticeable, it's been deliberate. Senior aides confirm she has not been summoned to a single meeting since the Windsor clause was activated. Instead, invitations have been redirected to Catherine. The change didn't happen overnight, but it happened with brutal efficiency. One Windsor insider revealed that where Camilla once sat at the decision-making table, her placecard has vanished, and no one has dared ask why. Catherine, poised and prepared, now receives all direct briefings on estate transitions, ceremonial coordination, and diplomatic messaging. What was once Camilla's domain by default has become Catherine's by design. There are no whispers of confrontation, only a quiet reassignment of trust. Inside Charles's inner circle, tension has begun to boil. Palace sources suggest that, behind closed doors, the king snapped at Camila in a moment of rare emotional fracture, accusing her of standing still while William consolidated everything. The comment, reportedly made during a strained morning meeting, sent shockwaves through their longtime staff. Camila, typically shielded from Charles's frustration, stood silent. It wasn't anger she wore, it was distance. As if she too had begun to feel the monarchy slipping from their grip. But it didn't stop there. A single frame of security footage, quietly leaked by a staff member on the verge of resignation, captured a moment that no one had been prepared to see. Camila and Princess Anne in a hallway, both frozen in a rare stare-down. Camilla's lips moved first, her tone sharp, though inaudible. Anne, stone-faced and unreadable, simply turned and walked away. It wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning. And in the palace halls, where gestures matter more than words, the message was clear: Camila had been marked as no longer essential to the forward motion of the crown. Soon after, several of Camilla's long-trusted aides were quietly reassigned or removed from Windsor operations altogether. Some were offered early retirement, others were encouraged to explore alternate positions. Within the royal household, a phrase that always means the same thing. Their exits were swift, quiet, and unquestioned. The Queen Consort's reach, once vast and discreetly influential, has been reduced to ceremonial appearances and secondary engagements. And yet, none of this has been confirmed. No press statements, no memos, just a palace growing colder around her, while the new power centres begin to pulse without her involvement. Those who once feared offending Camila now seek out Catherine's approval. Even Charles, in his grief-stricken confusion, appears to be drifting, no longer seeking comfort from the woman who stood with him through scandal and silence. What was once a united front is now a fractured throne. And as Camila fades from focus, another royal power broker rises, and she's not taking orders from the old guard. She doesn't need a crown to command attention. Palace sources reveal Catherine is already fulfilling key duties as the monarchy's unspoken matriarch. From Windsor protocols to international diplomacy, she's no longer just the Duchess, she's the system's silent backbone. While Charles isolates himself in grief, and William balances the weight of sudden ascendancy, Catherine has stepped into the void with a quiet but deliberate force. It began behind the scenes, subtle, almost invisible to those outside the palace walls. Yet within, her influence has become impossible to ignore. She now holds a formal advisory role in Windsor's evolving security infrastructure and restoration plans, decisions once dominated by Charles's private counsel. She doesn't just observe, she signs off, reviews intelligence briefings, cross-checks ceremonial protocols, and in at least 2 documented cases, she's overridden legacy orders that conflicted with the new trajectory of the crown. No backlash followed, only silent compliance, but perhaps most revealing are the private family meetings now reportedly chaired by Catherine herself, meetings where Charles is neither present nor invited. According to insiders, these gatherings address logistical planning for future royal tours, press strategy for the upcoming Commonwealth season, and restructuring Windsor's domestic staff. William is there, yes, but he doesn't lead, he listens. Catherine, by all accounts, holds the room. Her posture is measured, her words calculated, and behind her is a network of women who've earned a quiet reputation among staffers, as the quiet cabinet, a circle of aides, secretaries and policy advisors, loyal not just to the institution, but to Catherine's vision of its future. Among her staunchest allies is Princess Anne, who has broken decades of protocol to express open support for Catherine's central role. In one closed-door session overheard by a senior attendant, Anne was heard calling Catherine the bridge, the essential link between the monarchy's storied past and its fragile future. It was not flattery, it was confirmation. With Charles retreating into an emotional silence and Camilla effectively sidelined, Catherine has emerged as the palace's steady metronome, keeping pace while everything around her transforms. And then came the detail that caught everyone off guard. A series of documents, leaked through a discreet diplomatic source, confirmed that preparations for Catherine's coronation wardrobe were already underway, not publicly declared, not officially sanctioned, but set in motion all the same. High fashion houses have been quietly approached. Protocol officers have reviewed symbolism and crest placement. The message is clear. This is no longer hypothetical. It is imminent. Perhaps the most telling whisper comes not from courtiers, but from embassies. In diplomatic circles across Europe and the Commonwealth, Catherine's name is now floated with a different tone, no longer as the Duchess of Cambridge, but as Her Majesty in waiting. Ambassadors request briefings with her directly. Foreign policy advisors note her presence as a stabilizing signal. She is no longer simply beside the future of the crown, she is becoming its embodiment. But even as a new monarch in the making rises, not everyone agrees with the direction of this hidden succession. Behind the silken drapes of royal diplomacy, a secret alliance has formed. Its purpose? One name, Prince Andrew. His alleged attempts to leverage Windsor's transition sparked a coordinated lockdown of his influence. And the mastermind behind the block? William. In the chaos that followed the Queen's posthumous handover of Windsor to William, a dangerous undercurrent began to ripple through the institution Prince Andrew was trying to return, quietly, calculatedly, and with just enough plausible deniability. Legal advisors were caught off guard when Andrew's team began querying obscure clauses in the family estate contracts, particularly those surrounding royal annex usage and ceremonial access rights. Documents later confirmed that he was probing for loopholes and opportunity to re-enter the royal circuit by attaching himself to Windsor's rebirth. But this time William was ready. Him oved swiftly, without fanfare, without hesitation. Behind closed doors, William declared that Windsor would not become a shelter for the monarchy's shadows. His stance was unequivocal. Prince Andrew would not be permitted to use Windsor as a platform for image rehabilitation, influence building, or quiet reintegration. This was not up for debate. It was a line drawn with royal authority and, more surprisingly, with broad internal support. Princess Anne and Prince Edward, once hesitant to take public stances on Andrew, aligned firmly with William. They understood the optics. The crown was undergoing a tectonic shift, and the inclusion of Andrew, whose scandals had deeply wounded the institution, was an unacceptable risk. Together, they formed what insiders now refer to as the Shield Bloc, a covert but powerful triad within the palace, committed to freezing Andrew's every move. Meetings once scheduled with minor estate officials were suddenly cancelled. Invitations to private events at Windsor vanished. Access logs were reviewed. Andrew's name was erased. But the resistance wasn't universal. Camila, still reeling from her own diminishing influence, is rumoured to have pushed back. Sources suggest she viewed Andrew as a potential counterbalance, someone who, if restored to even a fraction of status, could provide leverage against the growing dominance of William and Catherine. The suggestion did not go over well. In one reported confrontation, William is said to have shut down the proposal before Camilla finished her sentence. From that moment, their already fraying relationship deteriorated into something colder and more adversarial. Then came the final blow. A planned private vie. Is it by Andrew to one of Windsor's lesser-known annexes, intended, perhaps, as a symbolic foothold, was abruptly intercepted. Royal security was informed hours before his arrival and instructed to lock down the wing. The message to Andrew was unmistakable. You are no longer welcome here. And though no official statement was released, the silence echoed louder than any announcement. Adding a final layer of gravity, unearthed private notes from Queen Elizabeth herself have now resurfaced. In a conversation recorded in the margins of her diary, she referred to Andrew's future as limited by consequence, not by choice. A line that, in retrospect, may have sealed more than just perception. It may have justified the quiet exile now unfolding in real time. But even with Andrew blocked and Camilla's role waning, there remains one question that no palace door can silence. He stood ready to surrender the crown. Then came Windsor. Now King Charles clutches a reign soaked in doubt and shadows. Has the legacy he longed to protect become the very thing pulling him under? Or has the Queen's final act set fire to the royal bloodline itself? In what was meant to be the quiet closure of a lifelong journey, Charles's private statement to his senior advisers shattered any illusions of retirement. "The throne is not a burden I can pass yet," he declared, not out of pride but out of panic. The Queen's transfer of Windsor to William didn't merely complicate the monarchy's optics, it dismantled the framework Charles had been building for decades. His abdication had been planned to symbolize control, not collapse. But now, any graceful transition would be interpreted not as vision but as defeat. And the very institution he had spent his life preparing to inherit seemed to be slipping from his grasp before he had truly begun to wield it. What began as personal betrayal has now spiraled into constitutional entanglement. Legal experts behind palace walls have expressed growing concern. The handover of Windsor, once a quiet procedural matter, is now an unexpected legal roadblock, because the estate represents not only symbolic royal presence, but also practical sovereignty. Charles's abdication cannot proceed without re-establishing a foundational balance of power. And yet, how can he reclaim Windsor's authority from a son who now legally and publicly embodies its future? The tension has carved fault lines through the palace. There are no longer just whispers of division, there are open factions. Team Charles is holding firm, composed of long-standing royal aides and traditionalists who believe in the sanctity of generational monarchy. But the Windsor bloc, forged in silence and led by William and Catherine, now operates with unprecedented access, confidence and strategy. Decisions are being made faster. Policies are being drafted without Charles's direct input. And no one is stopping it. Outside the palace, the response has been equally volatile. Polling data leaked from internal communications shows a startling